Good evening, everyone. It is such a wonderful thing to see such a full room, such an excited room. It's really an honor and a pleasure. My name is Sibel Raver, and I serve as Deputy Provost. And on behalf of both the Provost and the President, I welcome everyone here tonight. It's just terrific to see everyone. I really want to especially thank Dean Sundaram and his office for inviting me to share a few words tonight, and especially to extend an extremely warm welcome to the Javits family, and of course to their colleague, Jeff Kyle, and his partner, Danielle, and of course to all of you. This evening, we are really honored to hear from Professor Michael Posner of the NYU Stern School of Business. Stern is led, as you know, by our wonderful dean, Professor Sundaram, and he will introduce Professor Posner shortly. But I just want to take a few moments to recognize the accomplishments and the legacy of Jacob Javits and Marian B. Javits, particularly because of the support we receive from the Marian B. and Jacob Javits Foundation. We are so grateful for that partnership, and we thank the foundation for their continued support. The Jacob K. Javits Visiting Professorship was established in 2008, and it's to honor the memory and accomplishments of the four-term Senator Javits and to promote the values for which he fought. The professorship is awarded to an academic, a lawyer, a policymaker, a journalist, an historian, or a former elected official whose work focuses on issues close to the senator's interests. And those include health, civil rights, labor, foreign policy, disability rights, education, employment fairness, and economic security for working Americans. We can think about those issues as incredibly timely for our times today and incredibly important for this institution. As you know, NYU is very much a private university in public service. We have a very strong focus on inequality, equity, and opportunity at this institution. Senator Javits has a long and distinguished career of dedicating his life's work to his community. Born and raised in New York City, the senator earned a law degree from NYU. We're so glad to have our esteemed NYU Dean and President of NYU Emeritus, John Sexton, here as well. Senator Javits was elected initially to represent New York's 21st Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He subsequently served as New York State Attorney General for several years before being elected to the U.S. Senate, where he served for 4 terms. I think many of you already know, and I think it's really important to highlight the incredible force in policymaking that Senator Javits had in terms of his impact on our nation and our nation's future. He helped, for example, to create the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities. In 1973, he sponsored the War Powers Act, and he helped to pass the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which ensures fair private pension system. In recognition of his commitment to public service, Senator Javits was awarded multiple medals, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his exceptionally meritorious contributions to our country. The senator believes strongly in the power of bipartisanship in driving social progress, and he was well known for building effective coalitions to pass legislation that benefited the American people. To honor this legacy, in 2016, the Javits Foundation established the Jacob K. Javits Prize for Bipartisan Leadership. Professor Posner's talk tonight on restoring bipartisanship in the public and private sectors is a wonderful tribute to the senator's legacy. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dean Sundaram. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we really look forward to all the comments that will follow.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I'm the Dean of the Stern School of Business, Raghu Sundaram. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today. In many ways, I have the easiest and most pleasant task of all, introducing a truly wonderful colleague. But before I do that, just a few words of thanks. My thanks to the Javits family, the Javits Foundation for making this event possible. My thanks to Sybil for her introduction. My thanks to John Sexton, who's hiding at the back, the person who introduced us to Mike Posner and made it possible for Mike Posner to be here at Stern. And one last acknowledgement, a truly wonderful alumnus celebrating his 100th year now, a graduate of 1941 from Stern who is back at Stern for the 2nd time this week, who attends many of our alumni events, Alfred Abraham, the class of 1941. Thank you, Alfred. Thank you, Alfred. Stern this is the first time Stern has had the opportunity to host the Javits lecture, and we're particularly delighted about that. Because the subject matter, the broader subject matter of the Javits lecture, of the Javits Professorship, is something that is very close to Stern's heart. Some 20 years ago, a few colleagues of mine who had significant foresight saw the importance of the way business was evolving away from the traditional shareholder-focused model to broader concerns, and we became the first school to set up what is now in its 20th year, a business and society program that looks at the intersection of business and society, of business and its publics, business and law, business and the broader world, business and democracy, business and ethical leadership, business and professional responsibility. These have been incorporated into our curriculum in very deep ways by the wonderful faculty that lead the business and society area, into a social impact core that every one of our undergraduates has to go through, in addition to their liberal arts core and their business core, into professional responsibility courses that our MBA students go through. It is, in some ways, the richest part of the business education that they get today, because it brings together the technical skills that they acquire over their course here into analyzing problems of importance that they will look at not only in the business world tomorrow, but for the society of tomorrow. One of the exemplars of the business and society area is the person it is my privilege to introduce today, Mike Posner. Now, all of you have read Mike's bio and Mike's incredible achievements, both in the private and public sectors, but especially in the nonprofit world, in government over the last 3 decades. So I'm not going to revisit that part of his biography. But this I will say, there are resume virtues and there are the human virtues. And the nicest part about Mike is the human side of Mike. He's dealing with the kind of questions he does on business, on human rights. It's remarkable how cheerful he always is, but more that whenever there's anything to be done in the institute, he's the first person to put up his hand and say, I will volunteer to do this. So Mike came to Stern in 2014, as I said, courtesy John Sexton's introduction to us. We established in 2014, under Mike's leadership, the Center for Business and Human Rights, the first center of its sort in the world, and I think still the only real, I know there are some of Mike's proteges who've gone on to start other similar centers in Switzerland and elsewhere, but I think it's still the only real center of its sort. I've often told Mike that we should think about renaming the Center for Business and Democracy, because the hardest issue we are handling today is issues around liberal democracy and the ways in which business, not deliberately, not with any malice, is undermining some of the most difficult institutions that have been the most difficult to build over several hundred years. Liberal democracy itself is under threat in many ways today. And Mike has been at the forefront of leading the discussion around this through his center's work around fake news, and the topic of today, how to resolve bipartisanship. Fortunately, it says, I just looked at the topic, it says both in the public and in the private sector. In the private area, I think it should be a little bit easier to handle. He just had a piece on this topic in Forbes magazine, and I was pleased to meet one of the editors of Forbes when I came in who was talking about that. So without further ado, let me introduce Mike. Thank you all.
So thank you, Raghu, for those really warm words. I'm delighted to be here and really honored to be selected by the Javits family and their foundation as this year's Javits Visiting Professor. For the past 6 years, I've really been lucky to be here at Stern and to call it my home. In 2012, when I was at the State Department, a colleague and I decided to start this Center on Business and Human Rights at a business school. And I went to many of my West Side, Upper West Side liberal friends, some of whom were sitting here, and I told them what I was trying to do, and they said, mixing human rights and business sounds like an oxymoron. So I thought, oh my gosh, but I came to John Sexton, who's an old friend. And if you don't know John, he's an incredibly persuasive character. And he said, this is the right place to be. And he sent me to Peter Henry, to the business school, the dean then. And they were both unbelievably immediately receptive. John understood, Peter understood that human rights is vital to the success of a 21st century company, and it is to our society. And they saw an important gap that NYU could fill and supported the creation of our center. I'm really, as I say, incredibly indebted to John, to Peter, to Raghu, to Stern for allowing us this opportunity. Our vision was then, and it is still today, to challenge and to guide business in charting rules of the road for the 21st century global economy. Too often, the business model for companies is to do whatever they must do to make money in the short term, and then to give some money away to charity, to community, to arts groups, or to enhance their brand. We urge companies to move beyond this model of corporate social responsibility, which all too often has been more about protecting a company's brand reputation than how to change problematic business principles. We focus on how companies are making money, not how they give it away. And this is a tough agenda. Over the last 6 years, we've built a terrific team, privileged to be working alongside some similarly committed people at Stern, who Raghu mentioned. When I arrived, Peter connected me to Bruce Buchanan, who had the foresight 20 years ago to create the Business and Society program. He's now handed the baton to Batya Wiesenfeld, another great colleague who continues to lead this great program. Among our colleagues, one here is John Haidt, an author and a very prominent ethicist, and Tansy Whalen, who joined Stern several years ago from the Rainforest Alliance to create a Center for Sustainable Business. We've benefited greatly by NYU's commitment to taking risks and to thinking big. President Hamilton and Raghu, our current dean, don't just tolerate untested ideas and try to manage change. As you'll see if you go to the Stern website, they embrace change. Stern now is about how do you encourage new ideas. This is a core value for NYU and for Stern. It's also something that John did in his years as president. This is not a static place. It's a dynamic institution that's willing to take chances. So I want to reflect on one chapter of NYU's history, the story of a great American change agent named Jacob Javits. Javits grew up in a crowded tenement on the Lower East Side. He graduated from NYU Law in 1926. And beginning in 1947, he began a career of public service that took him to the U.S. House of Representatives for 7 years, New York State Attorney General for 2, and then for 24 years as a United States Senator. He belonged to a group known as Rockefeller Republicans, politicians who championed liberal social policies, prudent economic policies, and integrity in government. Sadly, today, Rockefeller Republicans are an endangered species. In fact, I hope they aren't actually extinct. There's a decline their decline in part is why we're having such a hard time finding common ground. So today I want to talk about the decline in bipartisanship in our politics, in our society, and offer some thoughts in particular about what the private sector can do to address our growing divisions and rekindle our capacity to reach out to each other, to the other. Senator Javits, just to spend a few more moments on his unbelievable career, he devoted his professional life to reaching across the aisle, looking for opportunities to forge links between Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. He was a problem solver, intensely focused on achieving practical results. If I can borrow a phrase from New York Times columnist Tom Friedman, he aimed to make a difference, not just to make a point. And his track record of accomplishments points to the value of bipartisanship. In 1957, he sponsored early civil rights legislation that laid the foundation for the landmark civil rights laws we all know of the 1960s. He was an enthusiastic supporter of workers' rights, understood the important role unions can play in empowering working people. He helped shape reforms of our pension system. There was a mention of ERISA. At a time when old age and poverty were often synonymous, ERISA, along with Social Security, made secure retirement possible for millions of Americans. He was active internationally, as was mentioned again. He was troubled by the escalation of US military involvement in Vietnam without adequate congressional say, and so he was a major force behind the adoption of the War Powers Act, and he actually wrote a book about it. Though he's mindful of maintaining control of our borders, he supported continued US leadership on refugee rights. The list of his accomplishments goes on and on and on. His success was rooted in pragmatism, passion, and principle. His actions were fueled by his commitment to fairness, equality, dignity, and integrity. A frustration with the corruption of Tammany Hall first drove Javits into politics. What's amazing is that he never became jaded. He maintained a firm moral compass and a devotion to principle throughout his long career. Unfortunately, these attributes seem in short supply these days amidst our growing political polarization. Now, it's all too easy to blame our divisions solely on our current president, whose actions and demeanor I find deeply disturbing. But I realize that the 2016 election and his continued popularity with a sizable minority of our population reflects deeper divisions within our society, often driven by anger and fear. Though the president clearly exacerbates these divisions, often on a daily basis, he didn't create them. Whatever our beliefs, it's incumbent on each of us to go the extra mile to understand the perspective of others whose views are antithetical to our own, and even to look for common ground. Much has been written about the growing polarization in our society, what one analyst calls a culture of contempt. A recent Pew study confirmed our partisan divisions are more intense and more personal than they've been in an awfully long time. 58% of Republicans now say that Democrats are more immoral than other Americans. Most Democrats say the same thing about Republicans. Men, older people are more likely to harbor these views. These negative feelings run very deep. In 1960, this is one statistic that jumped out at me, when pollsters asked people how they would feel if one of their children married someone from the other political party. 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said that they would be upset. They did the same polling in 2010. Half of the Republicans and more than a third of the Democrats harbored those sentiments. Today, 83% of respondents say if they discuss politics more than once a day, they feel angry about something they've heard or read. It seems that the only thing we can agree on now is how angry we are at each other. There are various explanations for how we descended into this partisan rancor. Some are obvious: increasing religious, racial, ethnic diversity in our society, growing gap in employment, income, health, even longevity between Americans, the demise of traditional news media, which once offered daily description of events that were widely accepted as accurate. Other factors are less obvious. Some people say it was the Cold War which united us against communism, or the passing of the World War II greatest generation. But I want to focus tonight on three broad trends that I think deserve special attention. The nature and scope of these things would deeply shock Senator Javits if he were alive today. The first is the rapid expansion of the global economy and its residual effects here at home. As I stress to my students in every course, the benefits of globalization are obvious. In the last 35 years, more than 2 billion people on our planet have been lifted out of extreme poverty. The private sector has played the key role, generating hundreds of millions of jobs. A globalized economy has given us access to more goods and services and greatly reduced costs. We enjoy blueberries and melons from Latin America in the dead of winter. We buy cheap clothing online, manufactured in Asia, and it's delivered to our doorsteps in a day or two. We spend hours every day on these various electronic devices we love, powered by batteries that are built with minerals mined in Africa. While we enjoy these advances, we've been too slow to address the social consequences accompanying this global growth. Because wages are so low, much lower in places like Mexico or China or Bangladesh, a significant portion of US manufacturing jobs, especially low-wage industries, have migrated to other places. Factory workers in Youngstown or Scranton or Flint who've lost their jobs have every reason to be upset and afraid for their future. But instead of finding ways to mitigate these negative consequences, politicians of all stripes too often fuel popular anger by demonizing trade agreements, dismissing the value of economic progress in developing countries, or trying to build walls around our country. These bromides fail to address the real challenges facing working and middle-class Americans. A second related change fueling polarization is economic inequality. The statistics are stark. Over the last 40 years, CEO compensation in the US has increased by 940%. It's 940%, while the salaries of the lowest paid workers in the same companies has increased by only 12%. In fact, the average income for a majority of American workers have not risen at all since the 1980s. The gap between rich and poor is actually widening. The top 1% of all Americans are richer than the bottom 90%. These discrepancies have serious costs. Life expectancy in this country has actually fallen for 3 years in a row, affecting low-income communities disproportionately. Globally, Oxfam calculates, this is another wild statistic, the 26 richest people on our planet have wealth that's equal to the bottom 50%. That's 3.8 billion people. The need to right this balance is obvious. The third seismic shift relates to technology, the so-called fourth industrial revolution. Every day we see the benefits. We see advances in artificial intelligence, improving efficiency in everything from commuting to life-saving medical procedures. Instant global communications has suddenly become free of charge. In the 1980s, a phone call from Tokyo to San Francisco cost about $30 a minute. Now we get grumpy if our free video conferencing app takes a minute to upload. We take for granted the easy and immediate access the internet affords to us massive amounts of data on virtually every subject. But as with globalization, the explosion of technology also has brought new challenges. Power of states to collect data often results in unchecked surveillance that violates our privacy. Misapplication of data leads to discrimination in areas ranging from law enforcement to home loans. Discrimination amplifies racism and biases that already exist in our society. Automated production means robots are replacing people, many of whom struggle finding another job. And as we've witnessed in recent years, various forms of political disinformation now pollute social media and threaten our very democratic discourse. It's easy to get overwhelmed, and at this moment in what I'm saying, you're probably feeling a bit overwhelmed, and to retreat into our partisan corners, curse our political rivals. But inaction's actually not an option. There's too much at stake. Each of us needs to find a way to contribute to solving these difficult problems. As the first human rights center at a business school, we're convinced that it's really possible to persuade the world's largest companies to help tackle these vexing challenges. We take a pro-company high standards approach. We focus on what it will mean practically to integrate human rights into core business models. If these issues are regulated to the margins of corporate management, progress is never going to occur. Once companies do recognize these as business priorities, we stand ready to work with them to develop industry-specific standards and metrics and to build credible systems to assess their performance in a way that will enable fair comparison against their peers. Our industry-based focus started with the apparel manufacturers and their global supply chains. 5 weeks after we came to Stern, the Rana Plaza factory complex in Bangladesh collapsed. 1,100 garment workers, most of them young women, were killed. 2,500 others were injured. We quickly organized a working session in this room where we brought together some of the largest Western clothing brands, the Walmarts, the Gaps, along with their local Bangladeshi suppliers, representative of about 7 Western governments, and international organizations like the World Bank. We became part of a larger effort to forge industry-government cooperation on factory safety issues in Bangladesh, and these efforts really have contributed to measurable improvement conditions in the first-tier factories. But as we pursued our engagement, we also saw the widespread existence of largely invisible subcontracting factories. These are the places where workers are often in the greatest jeopardy. We did exhaustive research. We documented the existence, took us a year, of several thousand subcontracting factories across Bangladesh producing for export. We came up with a chart, which is online, names and addresses of 7,100 factories. Recognizing resource constraints in Bangladesh to tackle this really massive challenge, we're now proposing, working to build a model of what we call shared responsibility, where Western governments' brands will work with their Bangladeshi counterparts, the World Bank, philanthropy, to create a common fund to fix these neglected factories. Bangladesh is a frontline state in the struggle to make respect for human dignity a minimum standard for global supply chains. As Western consumers and investors, we each have a responsibility to support companies that dedicate appropriate resources to improving these working conditions. With respect to the challenge of inequality, we believe the investment sector has a uniquely important role to play, and Stern has been a school with a very proud and excellent finance department for many, many years. Raghu has been a proud part of that. I'm also proud to hold the Jerome Kohlberg Chair in Ethics and Finance, and I think our work with this sector advances the late Mr. Kohlberg's vision. Recently, financial leaders in this city, Larry Fink, Jamie Dimon, Ray Dalio, have warned the gains generated by our current financial system are not being adequately shared. In August, quite remarkable statement, 180 corporate CEOs through the Business Roundtable underscored this point, acknowledging, and they haven't done this very often in the past, that corporations need to serve the interests not only of their shareholders, but also their workers, contractors, and the communities where they operate. But for these aspirational pronouncements to gain traction, Wall Street firms need to abandon a model primarily focused on short-term shareholder returns and move toward a broader approach that also better serves the long-term well-being of our society as a whole. As they do, we will need better measures of corporate performance on human rights. My colleague who's here, wonderful colleague, Casey O'Connor-Willis, is leading our efforts in this crucial area, working to give greater coherence and practicality to the social component of what the investment community calls ESG, meaning environment, social, and governance. Investment funds that include ESG factors are expanding, driven in part by women and millennial investors who assign greater priority to these concerns. But our research has concluded that the current measures investors use to assess social human rights performance are failing, and actually quite miserably. They assess promises, not performance, analyze what's most convenient, not what's most meaningful. Investors need better and more reliable comparative information on which companies are actually doing a good job, especially in addressing factors that lead to inequality. Though we're still at an early stage of this, our aim is to build a model for the social element, that would better enable investors to respond to this urgent challenge. Inequality also presents itself in the lack of diversity in the upper echelons of the investment sector itself. In 2017, the Knight Foundation did a study which found that investment firms owned by women or underrepresented minorities only oversee about 1% of the roughly $70 trillion in assets under management. In addressing this daunting challenge, we look to Eleanor Roosevelt for inspiration. She once wrote that human rights begin in places close to home. In that spirit, we're working with Robert Kennedy Human Rights Organization to encourage greater diversity within university endowment funds, including NYU, which collectively hold about $500 billion. Without asking schools to sacrifice financial returns, we're encouraging university investment offices to go the extra mile to give women and minority-owned firms a serious shot at competing for this business. Last year, we hosted a conference with trustees, investment officers from 13 of the wealthiest schools, including NYU. In the spring, we're going to hold a follow-up meeting. We're going to invite representatives of the 30 schools with the largest endowments. Schools like University of Chicago, Georgetown, NYU are stepping up to accept this challenge, and we're their eager partners. Finally, last point, with respect to the breathtaking advances in technology, we focused on internet governance and the growing threat to our democracy posed by political disinformation on social media. Our deputy director, who's here, Paul Barrett, is leading the charge. We were very fortunate to lure Paul away from 3 decades of excellence in journalism, both with the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg Businessweek. He's now applying his very considerable talents to authoring now 4 reports we've done on disinformation. Initially, we focused on misuse of the internet platforms by foreign governments, notably the Russians. This year, we turned our attention inward, examining disinformation generated by domestic users, including extremist groups who have an utter disregard for the truth. Our most recent report focused on the 2020 election. In each of these reports, we concentrate on the responsibilities of the internet platforms themselves, outlining practical steps they can and need to take to counter this pernicious disinformation. These issues are ever more critical as newspapers continue to decline. Americans are getting more of their news online. Because so many online sources peddle false political content, our failure to moderate online content sensibly is itself contributing to the significantly growing divisions within our society. Finally, an important part of our mission is to encourage other business schools to adopt the Stern model, embrace human rights as part of their teaching and research. Next week, we're going to co-host a meeting with the University of Geneva School of Management, where representatives of about 30 business schools from around the world are coming to discuss how they can get into this. Early stage, a lot of them are still trying to find their way. They don't have a John Sexton, they don't have a Raghu Sundaram to help them. But I'm confident we're going to make that happen. The common theme in all of our work is a commitment to applying core human rights principles and standards to business. Taking a page from Senator Javits, we endeavor to tackle these challenges in a manner that builds broad alliances and achieves practical results. And while the corporate sector by itself cannot eliminate polarization in our society or restore greater bipartisanship, without meaningful private sector engagement, these larger efforts are sure to fail. Senator Javits once said, "The business properly understood is central to every aspect of our civilization." We share that perspective, and we see growing opportunities for business schools and the future business leaders we teach to build responsible global supply chains, an investment system that promotes greater economic equality, and well-managed social media platforms that advance rather than detract from democratic discourse. To say the least, this is an ambitious agenda, but as Senator Javits also said, there's nothing to be gained by waiting for a better situation. You see where you are, and you do what you can. So we invite you to join with us in doing what we can in pursuing this timely and exciting agenda. Thank you very much. Now, I know we have a few microphones around, and I'd be glad to take a few questions, have a little conversation here. I'll call on people if you don't ask questions. I've been known to do that. So please, who wants to ask the first question? I must have said something to provoke somebody. There you are. There's a microphone coming to you right now.
Thank you. As a retired newspaper editor, I have given some thought to how one might moderate, as you said, the bad actors on the internet, but I can't think of any way to do that other than to eradicate free speech, as the Chinese have done. Do you think there are ways to do it that will actually work?
Yes. The key word you use, or that we use a lot, is to mitigate the worst effects. We're never going to eliminate bad things on the internet. It's too pervasive. The volume is too great. But I think when you talk about free speech, I think there's a different standard that applies to the internet platforms, as it does to the news media you used to work for. And so if you start from a premise, we start from some really simple premises, especially in the political sphere. If there is provably false content that is flooding the system, the Holocaust never happened. Obama was born in Kenya. The Pope endorsed Trump. There's a range of things. I could give you a long list. The students in Florida were actors. They're really not students. If there's things like that that are going viral, the companies ought to take it down. Now, the companies moderate content all the time, but they say, you know, we're not editors of the New York Times. We're more like plumbers or like telephone companies. Stuff runs through our pipes. And we say, we need a third paradigm. You're not editors of the New York Times, but you're not plumbers. And we send very simple recommendations, which they so far haven't accepted, but we're going to keep at it. One is that they find somebody like you and say, we're going to have a senior news person, somebody with news judgment, as a content moderator of our sites. Paul and I, and Paul deals with this a lot more than I do, when we go and talk to Facebook, there may be 8 different entities at Facebook or YouTube, which they own, or Instagram, dealing with aspects of content moderation. They may not even know what each other are doing. There's nobody senior in that company, nobody senior at Google, which owns YouTube, nobody senior reporting to the CEO who's a content overseer. So the first thing is coordinate internally. That's just good business practice. If it's provably false and it's going viral, especially in the political space, take it down. They demote it. There's lots of conversation. But we have to together figure out this third paradigm. It's not going to be perfect, but it can be a heck of a lot better than what it is now. The internet is out of control now in the political sphere. You just go on every day and take a look at what's going on. And it is undermining our politics. It's creating massive confusion. And it is increasing the polarization that I was talking about. These are issues that are going to help determine whether we maintain our democratic vigor. So I think there's room to move. Yeah, please.
Thank you. If you mentioned that I think it was 140 companies, CEOs got together to discuss that they were making much too much money, something like that.
Yeah. Well, what they said is that they have to have a broader mission than just short-term shareholder returns.
What did they do about that? In part, what do they do about their own sort of situations, as well as what do they do generally in their companies to change that kind of agenda?
So, my view is I take a kind of Ronald Reagan view, trust but verify. I think it's great that they issued the statement. I think it gives us a beachhead. These 180 CEOs have said we have to rethink the way we operate. Do they know what they mean by that? I don't think so, not exactly. Do they have a practical plan for doing it? I'm sure they don't. But it's an opportunity. And so we will undoubtedly, I'm trying to go down actually and see them and sort of say, what are you up to? I'm hoping to do that next month.
How long ago was that meeting?
What's that?
How long ago was that meeting?
The statement came out in August. And it never saw anything like that before. So I think we're early stage. We may be on the 3-yard line, but we're heading towards the other goal.
That's not encouraging. Can you give us your thoughts about conduct and culture in corporate America, and particularly with reference to, what officials might do to encourage appropriate conduct and culture, change the norms within companies?
Yeah, it's a really important question. It's actually what John Haidt, my colleague, works on a lot with his ethical systems program. So much is determined by the culture of a company. So much of the culture is determined by who's running the company. The best companies are run by people who would agree with virtually everything I said, and they're trying hard. One of the challenges we face, I think even the best companies, the best public companies, is this, the ferocity of the investment model that says, every 3 months you have to give us your quarterly earnings and you have to say that you met your number. It forces companies often to do things in the short term that aren't even in the company's best interest in the long term. It puts pressure on them. So I think one of the things we have to do is create some more space for good leaders of good companies to do what they know is the right thing. You see it a lot more in Europe. European investors are much more attuned to this. Some of the public funds, state pension funds and others want to do the right thing. I mentioned that women and millennials are much more inclined to be thinking about these things. All the surveys say twice as likely as old white guys like me to pay attention to these things. So, but I think the answer to your question is it's really critical to look at these issues of culture and try to figure out in a more systematic way, how do you instill these values? Hopefully we're doing it at Stern with the people we're teaching that are going out the door. I tell my students, I'm teaching you for your 7th job. When you go to Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, they're not going to ask you your views on human rights. But if you're running a big Fortune 500 company, these are the things that keep you up at night. So I think part of our role, as I see it, is to prepare them for that 7th job. But it's also what John's doing, really trying to think systematically. How do we think mindfully about what the culture is and how to encourage those leaders that are the best? They're out there. There's actually quite a few that are trying to do the right thing. In the back there.
Going back to the question about social media moderation,
Yeah.
how do we deal then, we're talking about the private side, the public response? Because especially in Congress, even though companies might want to moderate, when they do moderate, they get this very, very large negative backlash. If you look at especially some of the responses among conservative politicians to some of the moderation, there's been like the last 3-4 years, there's been like last 2 years, on the conservative side, a massive growth and interest in, breaking up some of these tech companies because they think they're being censored. So even if we want, companies want to do that, they have this, fear. How do we deal with the bipartisanship on getting rid of fake news on the public side as well to encourage these private companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think our instinct has been and continues to be content moderation by governments, dictated by governments, often leads to a bad place. So when I was in the government, one of the first things I dealt with was the Green Revolution in Iran. And the Iranian government announced that they were creating the halal internet. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. Every government gets to decide what's halal, what's kosher. So I worry about that. And there are plenty of, suited governments now that are trying to control access to the internet or control content. There are some specific things I think governments can and should do. There's a bill in Congress, Amy Klobuchar and Senator Mark Warner have introduced a bill with Lindsey Graham, now it was McCain, called the Honest Ads Act. We're in an odd place where political ads are regulated. You have to, if you have an ad on TV or in a newspaper, you have to say this ad was paid for, sponsored by whoever. We don't have it for online. Crazy. That should be, government ought to regulate that. And frankly, an agency like the FCC or FTC that has real regulatory power ought to be on that. The companies say, again, we're doing that voluntarily. I'm back to Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. Want some government agent making sure that those ads are regulated. So there's a role for government, but I'm very nervous about, there the First Amendment issues really do make me nervous. Government regulation, and especially, as you say, where we are in such a partisan moment, government interference, I think, is going to cause a lot of mischief. Please.
Thanks, Mike. But two questions. First, could you just summarize for us what are the main recommendations to restore bipartisanship? I have reduce inequality and rein in the platforms, neither of which sounds very easy to do. But were there others? What were the main recommendations?
Well, I talked about regulating the supply chain. Yeah.
Would that restore bipartisanship? I mean, that's a good thing to do, but how would
Yeah,
that?
well, I think, yes, so it's a good question. I think in this sense, we are living in a world where lots of people are affected negatively by loss of jobs, by a sense that the system isn't fair, and they're looking for some sense that they're not the only ones being singled out, and it's incumbent on American companies, global companies, to say, you know what, we actually do care about workers, we care about them here, we care about them in the rest of the world. And so to create a kind of fair system across the board, it will send a signal. It may not restore, if you're the worker who lost their job in Scranton, Pennsylvania, it may not restore your job. Again, there's not an easy answer to that, but I think the act of companies saying, we're global citizens, we're paying attention to these issues, we're concerned about workers' rights here and there. We have to make that connection. It's, one of the challenges we faced is this discussion often kind of deteriorates into how do you protect American jobs, and we ignore what's going on globally. We need to bring those two together. American workers and workers in Bangladesh share a common set of challenges. They need to be reinforcing each other. And companies need to signal the fact, we care about you here, we care about them there, and we are trying to be fair, we're trying to be good citizens.
Okay, thank you. On the question of how to have less toxic, less destructive internet platforms and social media, you hear there's some skepticism about what happens if we try to moderate content. I've been very interested in ways to be more careful about who can open accounts that can reach large numbers of people with zero identification, zero accountability, zero identity checks. And so I've been writing, I have an article in The Atlantic in this month arguing that we need to end that not that you have to show your driver's license to Facebook, I wouldn't trust them with it, but that there could be third parties. My point is trying to moderate the content. I mean, the content is almost infinite every day, but the number of users so that is much lower. And so what we proposed is that if you want to open an account, you have to at least show that you're a real person somewhere. And that would eliminate a lot of the trolling, a lot of the death threats, some of the racist threats. What are your thoughts on what the platform should do to do something about verifying that a person is a human being?
Yeah, and now again, Paul sitting behind you probably can give you a more complete answer to this.
Okay, well.
Do you want I'll just give you a couple of thoughts. One, I think it's it's a piece of the puzzle, for sure. One, this is not either or, we ought to be looking at both. One of the three big platforms we're looking at, Twitter, lives on anonymous accounts. So that, and I think some people have said to us, if you eliminated the bots, the robot, the fake accounts, their business would change dramatically. Now, it's also true, and my human rights friends say, if you start to require disclosure, put yourself in the context of China or Russia, a lot of activists say the anonymity actually gives us the ability to communicate.
Oh, no, you could still post anonymously. It's just that to open the account, you have to prove that you're a human being.
But prove to who?
Somebody. No, not to the platform. To a
So
third party,
that's the conversation.
a nonprofit.
That's the conversation. I think it's clearly part of the discussion. And to be fair to the platforms, sites like Infowars, Alex Jones, they did take the site down eventually. So some of that is going on, but I think we think we acknowledge this is hugely complicated, both in terms of the amount of material and the number of users. Facebook has, 2.3 billion users? We're not talking about, that's not a small task either to keep track of them. We've got to do all of the above. And it seems to me, again, there is a way to do better. We can't do worse than we're doing. And so I think we start with some very simple things, straightforward things. These are businesses that have grown unbelievably quickly, faster than they anticipated. They have to behave like big, global, responsible citizens, and they're going to need to spend more money. The part of my conversation they least like is when I say to them, you've got some huge global problems, and you're going to have to put a lot more money to get this right. Yeah, please.
Sorry.
Since you're right next to
We've now heard the term global in terms of solutions and problems. You mentioned the plaza issue in Bangladesh. Obviously, many of these issues are beyond one government or one country, especially in the developing world. So my question would be whether you're concerned about the continued erosion of the multilateral platform. World Trade Organization, many of the UN organizations are being defunded by governments everywhere due to populism and the rise of right-wing extremism. So is this an issue you see?
So I'm proud to call myself a globalist. I believe in the UN. I believe in international organizations. They haven't done a great job on these issues, honestly. We do a lot of work with the International Labor Organization. They have good standards, good conventions, good structure of what ought to be done, but they're not very good at implementing. And so I never will give up on these institutions, but I'm also not waiting for them to be the solution. They're a platform, for sure. I'll give you an example with the International Labor Organization. It took them 25 years to agree to do a study on global supply chains. They did that 2 years ago. It got so contentious internally that they suspended the study. So I'm not waiting another 25 years for them to figure out how to deal with global supply chains. Good people there, well-intentioned, the tripartite, industry, union, government, and 190 countries. Boy, it's tough to get consensus on almost anything. So I believe in the system. I want it to work, but our view is we've got to take the bull by the horns. We're in a business school. I want businesses, global businesses, to be leaders on this. I'm over in the back.
One of the trends that's parallel to a lot of the things that you discussed is an increase in CEO political activism. And we've observed a lot of that in the recent years. Do you think that's exacerbating the kind of polarization you talked about, or is that simply required to have a meaningful conversation on the issues related to the S in ESG?
Let me put it this way. If I were given a choice between a CEO deciding to figure out how to fix their business and how they're making money, or getting involved in some cause, even one I agree with, I would want them to focus first on getting their own house in order. Now, there's plenty of things where CEO speaking and speaking out is a good thing, but I think oftentimes that's a substitute for fixing their house. So we have not taken positions, on CEO joint statements on one thing and another. Again, I'm sympathetic to some, not to others. I don't think there's any reason they shouldn't speak out as public citizens. They're leaders of our community. But I'm always sort of coming back to how you running your company, and what are the core issues. Again, how are you making money? What's your core business? What's the business model? What's inherent in the business model that's causing a problem? And what are you doing about it? And what are you doing about it with your competitors? This is the one area where competition should be left at the door, if you're in the apparel sector, the energy sector, the tech sector, you got to work with your competitors. You have to develop industry standards. All these things are easy to say. They're not so easy to do. Please, one more question we're going to take right in the back.
Thank you, Professor. If it's the case that business have a shared responsibility in so many parts of civic life, then are there limits to where that responsibility ends?
Sure. I don't, again, one thing I said sort of in passing, I believe in the capitalist system. I believe in the market. I believe that companies are supposed to make money. So I'm not sitting there and telling Facebook to become a nonprofit. I think they're making a lot of money, and they could spend a bit more of it getting their house in order. So the issue here is not, is there unlimited capacity to do these things? I don't expect that, but we're a long way from getting to the line. And so often the case is, the kind of mentality, again, this is about the culture. The culture is we're going to maximize profit every quarter, whatever it takes to do it. And that sends you down a path to, making a lot of bad choices, both for your company and for society. I think we can moderate that in a way that will allow for healthy capitalism, healthy returns, healthy profits, and make our society better. So there's not a science to this. It's really a question of engaging and trying to come to some principled, practical way to moderate those two things. All right, thank you all.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to invite you all to stay for a reception, continue celebrating Mike and the Javits Foundation. And I'm going to do something slightly unorthodox. I know that everybody wants to talk to Mike, and I don't want Mike to get mobbed. So I'm going to do something odd. I'm going to introduce you to a few other of our amazing faculty. There are lots of our amazing faculty in this room. You will enjoy talking to them. There's Jonathan Haidt, one of the world's leading ethicists. There's Paul Haddad behind, who heads our entertainment and media program. There's Dick Berner in the back, who asked a question, who runs our Volatility and Risk Institute. Dick, you have to put up your hand, otherwise they won't know who you are. And there is our wonderful President Emeritus, John Sexton. I think one of the most visionary university presidents the country has ever had. So please do stay, please do mingle, please do talk to everybody. Thank you all for being here again.